Picture this. Your wife of over 4 decades is gone. The house you built as a team, the life you invested everything in, the woman who represented your entire world, all of it suddenly nothing more than memory. And before the blooms on her grave have had a chance to wilt, your own daughter sits across from you at the same kitchen table where you shared thousands of family dinners and orders you to leave. Not gently. Not tearfully. With the cold, flat tone of someone who has already run the numbers and concluded you no longer matter. Find someplace else to die, she says. You're worthless now. You don't yell. You don't plead. You simply rise, go up the stairs, and sit on the edge of the bed you occupied with your wife for 43 years. And that is when you discover it, a letter in her handwriting that alters everything. Because your wife knew. She knew long before you did. She saw what was approaching. And she prepared for it quietly, with the calm precision of her gaze. What unfolds next will force you to reconsider everything you believe about loyalty, inheritance, and the true meaning of family. There are secrets here that will steal your breath. There is a moment inside a lawyer's office that will drop your jaw. And there is an ending so fully earned, so complete, that you will feel compelled to tell someone about it the instant it finishes. Stay with us. Every minute of this story is worth your time. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I am 68 years old. A retired civil engineer who spent 40 decades constructing things designed to last, bridges, municipal buildings, foundations that could bear weight long after the men who poured them were gone. I excelled at my profession. But the most significant thing I ever helped build had nothing to do with concrete or steel. It was a life. A genuine one. And it was constructed with Eleanor. Some mornings I still wake and reach across the bed before I remember. Her side of the sheets is always cold now, and that chill travels straight through my palm into my chest and lingers there a while before I can rise and put the coffee on. That is simply how it is. I no longer resist it. I have learned that grief isn't something you conquer, it's something you carry, and with sufficient time and enough love still present in your memory, you learn to bear it without stumbling quite as often. The morning I want to tell you about, the one where everything in my life remained intact, I was sitting on the back porch of our home in Charlottesville, Virginia, with a cup of coffee growing lukewarm in my hands. It was a Tuesday in early October. The air carried that clean, distinct sharpness that arrives only once a year in the Blue Ridge foothills, and the garden Eleanor maintained behind the house was still holding its color, the red climbing roses along the white fence, the last of the summer tomatoes she had supported with old pantyhose because she claimed it was kinder to the vines. That garden was entirely her creation. I always joked that I could erect a hospital but couldn't keep a houseplant alive. Eleanor never disputed the point. We had been married 43 years by then. We met in the spring of 1979 on a construction site outside Roanoke, where I was conducting drainage surveys, and she was delivering permits from the county office. She wore a yellow blazer and carried a leather folder and regarded my muddy boots with an expression I can only describe as amused tolerance. I invited her to dinner that same afternoon. She said she would consider it. She called me the next morning at 7 a.m. and announced she had considered it. We married 18 months later in a small ceremony on Virginia Beach with 32 guests and a cake that tilted slightly leftward, which Eleanor claimed was my fault because I had insisted on carrying it from the car myself. We constructed our life the way people used to, carefully, stubbornly, together. I launched my engineering firm in 1982 with a used car, a used drafting table, and one municipal contract. Eleanor managed every dollar that entered our door. She had no formal training as a financial advisor, but she possessed a mind for it that I have never seen equaled. She read investment books the way other women read novels. She tracked market cycles in spiral notebooks kept in the bottom drawer of her nightstand. While I was out building other people's structures, Eleanor was quietly and methodically constructing our future: index funds, blue-chip stocks, a small commercial property in Waynesboro that she bought in 1994 and tripled in value. I knew the number, knew we had done well, but the full scope of what she had assembled over 30 years was something I understood only in the vaguest sense. Eleanor was the keeper of those books. I was, as I used to tell people, simply the man who built the house. Our daughter Cassandra, Cassie, was born in 1982, the same year I opened the firm. She was bright from the beginning, quick with words, charming when she chose to be. We gave her everything, and I don't say that with guilt exactly, only with the particular sadness of hindsight. She grew into a woman who knew her own worth in the way that can easily slide into believing that worth is owed rather than earned. She married Brent Hartwell at 36, a real estate broker from Richmond who wore nice shoes and laughed at his own jokes half a second before they landed. I tried to like him. I kept trying for 6 years. It was a Tuesday in October, coffee in hand, garden still bright, when Eleanor stepped onto the porch and sat in the chair beside mine and said she had received a call from the doctor that morning while I was in the shower. Stage 3, ovarian cancer. Treatable, the doctor had said, but we needed to be realistic. I set my cup down on the railing. I didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. Then I reached over and took her hand, and she let me hold it, and neither of us looked at each other, just out at the garden, the roses climbing the white fence in the October light. That evening, while I was rinsing the dinner dishes, Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had that look she wore when she had already decided something and was only now choosing to inform me. She said quietly that she needed me to make her a promise. Whatever happened, she said, she needed me to trust Morton Hale completely, no questions, no second-guessing, just trust. She said it the way she said everything important, simply, without decoration, as though the words were already fact and she was merely reading them aloud. I turned from the sink and looked at her standing there in the doorway, and something in her eyes, something steady and sorrowful and utterly sure of itself, made the back of my neck go cold. I promised her. I said yes before I had even fully processed what she was asking, because that was the nature of 43 years with the same person. You learn the weight of certain moments and you respond not with analysis but with instinct. She nodded when I said it, the way she always nodded when something had been settled to her satisfaction, and then she walked back into the kitchen and began wiping down the counter, and that was that. We did not speak of the promise again for a long time. But I did not forget it. Eleanor had a way of making words feel like signatures. The treatments began in November. The oncology center was a 40-minute drive from the house, and I drove her every time without exception. We developed a rhythm around it, the way you develop a rhythm around anything difficult, finding the small, reliable things and holding on to them. I always stopped at the same bakery on Route 29 for 2 cups of coffee before her appointments. And Eleanor always took exactly 3 sips of hers and then held the cup in both hands for the warmth, even when she wasn't drinking from it. In the waiting room I would read whatever was on the chair beside me, magazines, pamphlets, once a paperback thriller someone had left behind, and Eleanor would sit with her eyes closed and her hands folded in her lap, perfectly still, as though she were simply resting and not preparing to have poison run through her veins for the next several hours. She lost weight through the winter. Her hair thinned, and she cut what remained short, which suited her in a way the longer hair never quite had. What she did not lose, not for a single day of those 18 months, was the sharpness of her mind. She was reading financial statements in the oncology chair, taking calls from her broker between nausea episodes. I would come into the bedroom some evenings and find her sitting up against the pillows with her reading glasses on and 3 or 4 printed documents spread across the blanket, and she would look up at me and say she was just reviewing some paperwork and it was nothing I needed to worry about. There were 4 appointments with Morton Hale that I did not attend. I know the number because I only learned about them later. At the time, Eleanor told me only that she had some estate paperwork to update and that she didn't want me to sit in a lawyer's office for 2 hours reviewing documents she would find numbing dull. I believed her, partly because it sounded exactly like something Eleanor would say, and partly because I had spent our entire marriage trusting her judgment on matters she understood better than I did. Morton was a friend as much as he was our attorney. We had known him 20 years, played golf with him before Eleanor's knees made golf impractical, had dinner at his home every Christmas until his wife passed. If Eleanor was meeting with Morton, I told myself then, whatever needed to be handled was being handled by the 2 most capable people I knew. What I did not know, and would not understand until much later, was that Eleanor was in the process of transferring every dollar we had accumulated over 30 years into an irrevocable trust she had established in her own name. She worked through it methodically over those 4 sessions, the investment accounts, the portfolio, the commercial property in Waynesboro, everything organized and placed beyond the reach of probate, beyond the reach of a 30-year-old will, beyond the reach of anyone who might read that will and assumed they already knew what it contained. Cassie noticed the attorney visits before I did. She had always been observant in that particular way, less interested in how people were feeling than in what they were doing and why. She asked Eleanor directly one afternoon in January, standing in the kitchen while Eleanor was making tea, whether there was something happening with the estate that the family should discuss together. Eleanor poured the hot water into her cup and said that everything was being handled and there was nothing for anyone to worry about. She did it warmly, without a trace of evasion in her voice, and Cassie accepted it the way you accept an answer that is technically complete even when it doesn't quite address what you were actually asking. What Cassie did next I only learned about much later. She contacted the firm that had handled our legal work in the early years before we moved everything to Morton, a small practice in Staunton that still had copies of documents going back decades. She asked about our estate, and they sent her a copy of the will Eleanor and I had drafted together 12 years prior. She read it. She saw her own name. From what Morton later told me, she stopped reading at a certain point and did not finish the document. She had seen what she was looking for and concluded she already had her answer. After that, she began visiting Eleanor more often. She brought soup, flowers, audiobooks Eleanor had not asked for. She sat beside the bed and held her mother's hand and asked gentle, sideways questions, whether Eleanor had ever thought the house might feel too large eventually, whether she had considered what would become of the garden, whether Brent might be able to help advise on the investment account since he had so much experience with property values. Eleanor answered each one with the same calm, unhurried patience she brought to everything. I watched from the doorway sometimes and said nothing. Eleanor watched too. She saw everything Cassie was doing, every question behind the question. I know that now. She simply chose not to say so. Then on a Wednesday afternoon in late February, while I was raking leaves from the back garden, my phone rang. It was Morton. His voice had a particular quality I had not heard from him before, something careful and warm at the same time, like a man who is about to say something that matters and wants to get it exactly right. He told me that Eleanor had sent him a sealed envelope. Inside was a smaller envelope with my name on it. He said Eleanor had been very specific, he was to keep it and deliver it to me only after a certain event had occurred. I would know when the time was right, he said. Then Morton paused, and when he spoke again his voice had dropped just slightly, the way a person's voice drops when they mean something more than the words can quite hold. He said, "Gerald, your wife is a remarkable woman." I held that phrase for the rest of the afternoon. A remarkable woman, Morton had known Eleanor for 20 years, had seen her at her sharpest and at her most unguarded, and he was not a man who reached for compliments carelessly. I finished raking the leaves and stacked them by the fence and went inside and made dinner. Eleanor came down in her robe and sat at the kitchen table and ate half a bowl of soup and told me about a documentary she had watched that afternoon about migratory birds. I listened and asked questions, and we were just two people eating dinner together, and I did not ask her a single thing about Morton, or the envelope, or the promise she had extracted from me in the kitchen doorway months before. I had learned across 43 years that there were certain doors Eleanor would open in her own time and at no one else's invitation. By December she was sleeping more. The treatments had done what they could, and the doctors had shifted their language in that careful, practiced way that tells you everything without saying it plainly. We stopped driving to the oncology center. A hospice nurse named Patricia began coming to the house 3 mornings a week, a compact, efficient woman from Georgia who moved through our rooms with such quiet competence that Eleanor said she reminded her of a very organized cat. I appreciated Patricia more than I ever told her. She gave me permission, in the wordless way that competent people give permission, to simply be Eleanor's husband rather than her caretaker, and that was a gift I did not know I needed until it was given. We watched old films in the evenings, the ones Eleanor had always loved, the black and white pictures from the 40s and 50s with the sharp dialogue and the people who wore hats indoors. We listened to the jazz records she had collected since college, Coltrane and Bill Evans, and an old Ella Fitzgerald album with a cracked spine that had survived 4 moves and 37 years in our household. On the nights when Eleanor felt well enough to stay awake past 9, I would read to her from whatever novel she pointed to on the shelf beside the window, doing my best with the voices even when she told me my British accent sounded like a man gargling gravel. She laughed when she said it. I kept doing the voices because of the laugh. She talked more in those months than she had in years, not with the restless processing energy of someone working through things, but with the unhurried clarity of a person who has already worked through everything and simply wants the stories to be heard one more time. She told me about the afternoon she first saw me on that job site in Roanoke, how I had been arguing with a surveyor about a drainage calculation, and she had stood at the edge of the work zone listening. She had never seen me before. And what she had thought, watching me, was not that I was handsome or impressive but that I was someone who cared whether the numbers were right, whether they matched what I said and what I did. She said that was the thing that made her call the next morning. She talked about our wedding, about the cake that leaned, about the drive down to Virginia Beach the night before with everything packed into the back of my truck and the radio playing through static on the coastal highway. She talked about the night Cassie was born, February of 1982, how I had sat in the hospital corridor for 9 hours with my hard hat still hanging from my hand because I had come straight from a site and forgotten to leave it in the truck. And how the nurse had finally asked me if I intended to wear it into the delivery room. Eleanor laughed telling that story, then coughed, then laughed again. On the last morning, a Tuesday in February, when a thin, cold rain was moving through the valley, Eleanor woke briefly while I was sitting beside the bed with my coffee. She looked at me with full recognition, clear-eyed and present, the way she had looked at me 1,000 mornings. She said quietly that she had kept her promise. She said now it was my turn. I told her I remembered. She closed her eyes, and her breathing slowed, and by the time Patricia arrived at 8 o'clock, Eleanor was gone. The funeral was 4 days later at the church we had attended for 26 years. The pews were full. Eleanor had touched more lives than either of us had properly kept count of. Cassie stood at the front in a black dress and received condolences with the composed, gracious manner of a woman performing a role she had quietly rehearsed. She wept at the right moments. She said the right things. Brent stood beside her with his hands in the pockets of his overcoat, and I noticed, because I notice things even when I do not want to, that his eyes moved constantly around the room. Not with grief, not with memory, but with the particular restless attention of a man making assessments. Douglas Parrish, my neighbor of 17 years, stood beside me through the entire service without being asked and without saying much, which was exactly what I needed from another human being at that moment. At one point near the back of the room, I saw Brent step away from Cassie, press his phone to his ear, and turn toward the wall. Douglas saw it too. He said nothing, but I felt him shift his weight slightly and register it the way a man registers something he intends to remember. We came back to the house afterward, 20 or so people with coffee and casseroles, and I moved through it all on some reserve of functioning that I do not fully remember accessing. When the last guest had gone, and Cassie and Brent said their good nights, I climbed the stairs and went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and opened the drawer of Eleanor's nightstand. The envelope was there, just as Morton had described, her handwriting on the front, my name in her familiar slanted letters, and below it in pencil, so faint it was nearly ghost, for small words, "Now you may open." I reached for it, and then from directly below me through the floor and the quiet of the empty house, I heard Cassie's voice carrying up the stairwell with perfect clarity. She was not shouting. She was simply not bothering to be quiet. "When things are settled," she said, "we need to move fast. This house is at least $850,000. Brent already has someone he wants to bring through before spring." I set the envelope back in the drawer. I am not entirely sure why, my hand simply made the decision before my mind caught up with it. Perhaps it was the instinct to protect something fragile from a moment that did not deserve it. Whatever Eleanor had written to me, whatever she had kept and sealed and left in that drawer for me to find, it belonged to a different kind of silence than the one currently occupying the floor below me. I closed the drawer quietly, smoothed the edge of the bedspread where my hand had pressed it, and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the muffled rise and fall of Cassie and Brent's voices until the front door opened and closed and their car reversed out of the driveway and the street went quiet again. I did not sleep well that night or the 2 nights that followed. I moved through those days the way you move through the immediate aftermath of any great loss, on a kind of automatic pilot that handles the necessary tasks while the deeper part of you is somewhere else entirely, still standing in a February bedroom holding a cup of coffee that has gone cold. Patricia came by on the second morning to collect the medical equipment and left a casserole and a card signed from her whole family. Douglas came by on the third afternoon with a 6-pack of beer he set on the porch rail without comment, and we sat together until the sun went behind the trees. I ate. I answered phone calls. I wrote thank you notes for the flowers. And I did not open the drawer. Morton called on the morning of the 3rd day. He said he needed the 3 of us in his office, myself, Cassie, and Brent, to review the estate documents. Standard procedure, he said, required in Virginia for any probate matter. He said it the way Morton said most things, without particular inflection, as though he were reading from a list of facts that existed independently of any feeling anyone might have about them. We agreed on 11 o'clock the following morning. Morton's office on Water Street had not changed in the 20 years I had known it. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs that had absorbed the weight of 1,000 difficult conversations, a wall of legal volumes behind his desk that I was fairly certain he had actually read. His assistant brought coffee without being asked and then closed the door behind her. Morton sat behind the wide mahogany desk and opened a folder in front of him with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has done this enough times to understand that the room needs a moment to settle before anything useful can happen. Cassie sat to my left in the chair nearest the window. She had dressed carefully, a charcoal blazer, pearl earrings that had been Eleanor's, a detail that landed somewhere in my chest. Brent sat on her other side with a leather portfolio across his knees that he had not been asked to bring and had no apparent reason to have with him. His pen was already out. I noticed that and filed it away without comment. Morton read from the will Eleanor and I had drafted. You do the thinking once and then trust the structure to hold. The language was formal and precise, the way legal language is, moving through the standard provisions before arriving at the distribution of assets, the house and its contents to Cassandra Hartwell, the investment accounts and portfolio holdings to Cassandra Hartwell, personal property to be divided according to a separate written memorandum Eleanor had prepared, standard spousal provisions for my personal effects and certain named items. I watched Cassie from the corner of my eye as Morton read. She was working very hard to keep her expression neutral and was almost succeeding. Her hands were folded in her lap with a stillness that was slightly too deliberate, the stillness of someone who has been practicing it. Beside her, Brent's pen moved once across the top corner of whatever page he had opened in his portfolio, a small, swift notation, and then he capped it and did not write again. He did not need to. He had already heard what he had come to hear. I sat with my hands on my knees and looked at a middle point on Morton's desk and felt, more than anything else, enormously tired. When Morton finished reading, he closed the folder and set it to one side with a precise, deliberate movement. He said there were some additional documents that required separate review and that he would need to meet with me privately at my earliest convenience. He said it without explanation and without any change in his expression, the same steady, measured tone he had maintained throughout. Cassie's head turned toward him immediately. She asked whether the additional documents would affect the distribution of the estate in any way. Morton looked at her for a moment before he answered. He said that all matters had been arranged in complete accordance with Eleanor's wishes. Nothing more. Cassie held his gaze a half-second longer than was comfortable, then nodded and sat back. In the parking lot with the March air cold and thin around us, Cassie reached over and took my hand. Her grip was warm, and her voice, when she spoke, had that particular softness she deployed when she wanted to appear generous. She said I was not to worry about anything. She said she and Brent would take care of everything and make sure the transition was handled properly and that I should not carry any of this alone. I thanked her. I meant it in a different way than she intended it. She smiled and squeezed my hand once before letting go, and I looked at her, my daughter, Eleanor's daughter, the baby I had carried on my left shoulder for the first 2 years of her life because she always preferred that side, and in her eyes, behind the warmth and the careful smile, I saw something that had nothing to do with love. It was arithmetic. Clean, practiced, and already well advanced. The arithmetic did not take long to complete itself. 3 days after Morton's office, on a Saturday morning in mid-March, when the light was coming in low and pale through the kitchen windows, I was standing at the counter with my second cup of coffee and the newspaper folded open to the crossword I had not yet touched when I heard 2 cars pull into the driveway. I recognized the sound of Cassie's SUV. The second vehicle I did not recognize. I watched through the kitchen window as Cassie and Brent got out of their car and, with them, a third person I had never seen before, a woman in her 40s with a camel-colored blazer and a rigid leather portfolio under one arm, moving with the brisk, assessing energy of someone on the clock. She approached the front door with the particular expression of a person who is not seeing a home but a number. She pulled out her phone and took a photograph of the exterior before she had even reached the front door. They came in without knocking. Cassie had a key, had always had a key, and it had never before occurred to me that this was a thing worth reconsidering. The woman with the portfolio introduced herself with a name I did not retain and a handshake that was firm and impersonal. And then, without any further ceremony, she began moving through the front rooms of my house with a measuring device and her phone camera. She opened the door to the garage and stood in the frame making notes. She measured the width of the kitchen. She stood at the bottom of the staircase and photographed the crown molding. She moved through the rooms where Eleanor had lived and cooked and read and recovered and finally died with the efficient detachment of someone cataloging inventory, and I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it happen and felt something shift very slowly in the center of my chest, like a foundation taking on weight it was not designed to carry. Cassie sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands on the surface in front of her and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as managerial. She said she wanted to talk. I sat down across from her because my legs made that decision on their own, and the alternative was standing in my own kitchen like a stranger waiting to be told where to go, which, it turned out, was precisely what was about to happen. She said the house was part of Eleanor's estate. She said she had inherited it. She said she and Brent had given it careful thought and had decided to sell. She used the word transition and the phrase going forward and the phrase best for everyone, without apparent awareness of how each one landed. She said I had 30 days to make alternative arrangements. I looked at her across the table, at the hands she had folded there so deliberately, at the pearl earrings she was still wearing, Eleanor's earrings, which she had put on for Morton's office and apparently not taken off since. I said, with as much steadiness as I had available to me, that this was the house where her mother and I had lived for 35 years, that Eleanor had planted every shrub in the garden by hand, that the mark on the door frame of the laundry room, the one 3 feet and 4 inches up from the floor, was where we had measured Cassie's height every year on her birthday until she was 13 and told us she was too old for it. Cassie said I had spent 43 years in this house. She said that was enough time by anyone's measure. She said I was retired and living alone and had no practical need for 4 bedrooms, and that the longer the property sat, the more carrying costs accumulated. She was not wrong about any of the individual facts. She had simply arranged them into a shape that had nothing to do with truth. I stopped speaking. I did not have the words for what I was feeling, and I did not trust the ones that were closest to the surface, so I simply sat there and looked at my daughter and waited. Brent was standing near the refrigerator. He had not said a word since arriving. He was looking at his phone with the focused disengagement of a man who has agreed to be present at something unpleasant but sees no reason to actively participate in it. Then Cassie said the thing she said. I am not going to soften it or reframe it or suggest she did not mean it, because I believe she meant it completely, the way people mean things that have been waiting behind their teeth for longer than they have admitted to themselves. She said I was old. She said I was no longer useful to anyone. She said I should find somewhere else to go and not to wait to die there, because there was no reason for me to be taking up space in a house that had value and a future that did not include me. Brent did not look up from his phone. I stood up from the table. I did it slowly and without drama, the way I had stood up from 10,000 tables over 68 years, and I walked out of the kitchen and up the staircase and into the bedroom and sat down on the edge of the bed, Eleanor's side, the side she had risen from every morning for 35 years, the impression of her long since absorbed. I sat exactly where she would have sat. I opened the nightstand drawer. The envelope was there. Her handwriting on the front, the faint pencil beneath my name barely holding its shape against the paper. Now you may open. I looked at it for a moment that had no particular length, and then at last I picked it up and I did. The envelope was not sealed. The flap had been folded in and tucked the way Eleanor tucked everything, neatly, without adhesive, because she said glued envelopes suggested you did not trust the person you were writing to. I sat on the edge of the bed with the sounds of the house below me still filtering up through the floorboards, the murmur of Cassie's voice, the brisk click of the real estate agent's heels on the hardwood I had laid myself in 1994, and I unfolded the letter. 3 pages written on the cream stationery Eleanor kept in the top drawer of her writing desk. Her handwriting was smaller than it used to be, more careful, the letters formed with a deliberateness that I recognized as effort rather than style. She had written this when her hands were not entirely reliable, and she had written it anyway. She began with the summer of 1989. That was the summer we bought this house, she wrote, and I would like you to remember what it smelled like the first week: paint and polish, pine, and the particular dry warmth of rooms that have been closed up through a Virginia summer and are breathing again for the first time in months. She wrote about Cassie, who was 7 that August, running the length of the upstairs hallway in her socks because the floors were smooth and new and the running was irresistible. She wrote about the evening we ate our first dinner here, sitting on the kitchen floor because the table had not yet arrived, and we had chicken from a paper bag and iced tea in coffee mugs, and Eleanor had laughed so long and hard at something I said that she spilled her tea down the front of her shirt, and we laughed about that too until it was dark outside and we had no idea where we had packed the lamp. I read slowly. I was aware, distantly, of the sounds from the floor below, but they were receding, becoming less relevant with every paragraph, as though Eleanor's voice on the page was a frequency that crowded out all others. Halfway through the second page, her tone shifted. Not to anything sharp or urgent, Eleanor did not write that way, but to something more precise, the way her voice got when she was making sure a thing was understood correctly. She wrote, "Do you remember what the attorney told us in 1989, when we first put the deed together?" She wrote that I had been carrying debt from the engineering firm, a line of credit that was standard for a growing company, but that the attorney had flagged as a complication for joint property ownership. His recommendation had been to put the house in my name alone, Gerald Allen Whitmore, sole owner of record, until the business debt was retired. She wrote that we had followed that advice and recorded the deed accordingly. And then she wrote the sentence I read 4 times before I moved past it. She wrote, "I never changed it, Gerald. I never had any reason to. This house has been in your name from the first day, and it is in your name today, and it will be in your name when you read this, because it belongs to you. It has always belonged to you, *. I set the letter down on the bed beside me. I looked at the wall. Outside the window, the March light was thin and honest, and the bare branches of the oak Eleanor had planted in our first year here moved slightly in a wind I could not hear through the glass. I picked the letter back up and read the sentence again. And then once more. I do not know exactly how many times I read it before I moved on to the 3rd page. The final section was brief. She wrote that the rest of it, everything she had built over 30 years, every account and asset and carefully tended investment, was in Morton's keeping. She wrote that she had taken care of it, taken care of us, and that she needed me to trust that the structure she had put in place would hold, because she had built it to hold the way I had always built things to hold, and the two of us had always understood each other on that point. She signed it with her name, and below her name she had written in the same faint pencil she had used on the envelope 4 additional words, "I kept my promise." I sat with the letter for a long time. Then I picked up my phone from the nightstand and called Morton. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting the call. I said his name, and he said mine. And then there was a brief silence of the kind that happens between people who understand each other well enough not to fill every pause with words. He said he could see me first thing tomorrow morning and to please bring the letter with me. He said it with a particular steadiness in his voice that made me feel, for the first time in a week, as though the ground beneath me was not entirely provisional. I came down the stairs to find Cassie and the agent still in the front room, Brent standing near the door with his arms crossed. Cassie turned when she heard me on the stairs and began to say something about the timeline for the 30 days. I said, clearly and without particular volume, that I needed everyone to leave. Cassie's expression shifted to the careful patience of a person humoring someone they have already discounted. She said we had already discussed this. I said that tomorrow morning I had an appointment with Morton Hale, and that until I had kept that appointment, this was my home and I was asking them to leave it now. No one moved for a moment. Then the agent began gathering her portfolio. Brent pushed off the wall. Cassie walked to the front door without looking at me and put her hand on the knob and pulled it open, and the cold evening air came in around the frame. She paused in the doorway with her back to me, and I caught her reflection in the long mirror in the front hall, her profile, her jaw, the set of her shoulders. She was not angry. I had expected anger or contempt or one more careful word designed to remind me of my diminished position. Instead, in the glass, what I saw move across her face was something I had not prepared for at all. It was fear. I did not sleep, but I rested, which is a different thing and sometimes sufficient. I lay on top of the bed covers in the dark with Eleanor's letter on the nightstand beside me and let the house settle around me the way old houses do, the small contractions of wood and pipe and plaster that had been the background sound of my nights for 35 years. By 6 in the morning I had showered and dressed and eaten a piece of toast I did not taste. By 7:30 I was in my car with the letter in my inside jacket pocket, driving through the pale early light of a March morning toward Morton's office on Water Street. His assistant was not yet in when I arrived. Morton himself opened the door, already in his jacket and tie, with 2 cups of coffee on the credenza behind his desk. He shook my hand the way he had shaken it for 20 years, firmly and without theater, and gestured to the chair across from his desk and sat down in his own and looked at me for a moment before either of us spoke. He asked how I was holding up. I told him I was holding. He nodded as though that were the correct answer, and then he opened the first of several folders arranged in a precise row to his right, and we began. He started with the deed. He had pulled the county land records, which he spread open on the desk between us, the original filing from 1989, an updated recording from 2004 when we had refinanced, and the current record as it stood in the Albemarle County Registry. My name on every page. Gerald Allen Whitmore. No joint tenancy. No right of survivorship language that would have created any automatic transfer. Sole owner of record from the day the ink was dry to the present morning. Morton said that Cassie had no legal standing to sell the property, no legal standing to transfer title, and no legal standing to compel me to vacate. He said if anyone had advised her otherwise, they had done so without reviewing the actual documents. He said all of this in the same even tone he might use to explain a zoning variance. And I sat and listened and felt something in my chest begin very slowly to unknot. Then he opened the second folder, and what he laid out across the next 30 minutes rearranged my understanding of the past 18 months entirely. Eleanor had established what Morton called an irrevocable trust, the Eleanor Whitmore Family Trust, 14 months before she died. She had worked through it across 4 separate sessions in this office, transferring into it every significant asset we held, the investment accounts, the brokerage portfolio, the commercial property in Waynesboro, everything that had accumulated across 3 decades of her careful and persistent attention to our financial life. Because the trust was irrevocable, and because the assets had been formally transferred before her death, none of it passed through her estate. None of it was subject to probate. None of it was governed by the will Morton had read aloud 3 days ago in this same room. The will had been read because Virginia probate procedure required it to be read, but there was nothing for it to distribute. The structure Eleanor had built had already absorbed everything. I asked Morton what the trust contained for me specifically. He turned to the 3rd folder and read the relevant provision without preamble. I was named primary beneficiary. The trust would distribute to me an annual income of $180,000 for the remainder of my life, administered through the trust account and reviewed annually by the trustee, who was Morton himself. The principal, $31.5 million at the time of transfer, now somewhat larger given the intervening months of market performance, would remain in the trust beyond my lifetime, allocated toward charitable purposes and an educational subtrust for future grandchildren. The details of which Morton said he would cover separately. I sat with that number for a moment. $31 million. I had known the approximate scale of what Eleanor had built. Knowing it and hearing it read aloud in a legal document were two experiences with very little overlap. As for Cassie, Morton said her name appeared in the trust document exactly once. She had been designated to receive $500,000 from Eleanor's personal checking account, a transfer that had already been executed according to Eleanor's prior instructions. That was the full extent of her beneficial interest. She was not named in the trust. She had no claim on the trust assets. She had received what Eleanor had decided to give her, and the structure of the document made that decision final and unreviewable. I thought about the afternoon Cassie had sat across from me at that kitchen table, so composed, so certain, having read the old will and seen her name at the top of the distribution, and concluded she already understood the complete picture. She had stopped reading too soon. Morton said it simply, without any evident satisfaction. She had seen what she expected to find and had not looked further. I did not say anything in response. I looked at a point on Morton's desk and thought about what it cost to have already known the answer. Morton straightened the folders and aligned them with the edge of the desk, a habitual gesture I had watched him make 100 times. He said there was one additional matter he needed to cover. He said Eleanor had left a specific set of instructions pertaining to a particular circumstance, and that the circumstance he was referring to was precisely what had occurred over the past 3 days. He reached for a fourth folder, thinner than the others, and placed it on the desk between us without opening it yet. He rested his hand flat on the cover. He said, "Gerald, your wife thought of everything." Morton opened the fourth folder with the same deliberate care he had applied to everything else that morning. But there was something different in the gesture this time, a slight pause before his hand moved, the way a person pauses before opening something they know will matter. He said Eleanor had prepared a specific letter, separate from all trust documents and separate from the letter she had left for me, intended for Cassie. He said Eleanor had given him precise instructions. This letter was to be delivered to Cassie only if Cassie attempted to remove me from the house or severed contact with me in the period following Eleanor's death. He said that if neither of those things had occurred, the letter would have remained sealed indefinitely, and Cassie would never have known it existed. He looked at me steadily over the top of his reading glasses. He did not need to say what we both understood, which was that the letter was now very much relevant. He asked whether I would like to hear it before it was delivered to Cassie. Eleanor had anticipated this question too and had left it to my discretion. I said yes. Morton unfolded 2 handwritten pages and read Eleanor's words aloud in his measured, unhurried voice, and I sat across from him in the leather chair and listened to my wife speak to our daughter from the far side of whatever boundary separates the living from the people who love them. Eleanor opened by saying that if Cassie was reading this letter, a choice had been made, and that she was not going to pretend she did not know which choice it was. The tone was not cold. It was something more precise than cold. It was the voice of a woman who had loved someone completely and clearly without illusion for more than 4 decades and who was now speaking from that same clarity. She wrote that she had spent 42 years loving Cassie and 43 years loving me, and that neither of those loves had ever required her to choose between them, but that Cassie had apparently decided otherwise. She wrote that she had watched in her last 2 years as something shifted in her daughter, not suddenly but gradually, the way a house shifts when the soil beneath it changes, almost imperceptible until the doors stop closing properly. She wrote that she did not entirely blame Cassie for this, and she did not entirely excuse her either, because both of those responses would have been condescending, and Eleanor had never been willing to condescend to her own child. Morton paused once briefly, took a sip of his coffee, and then continued. Eleanor wrote about the trust, explaining its structure in plain language with none of the legal formality Morton had used with me. She wrote it the way she would have explained a household budget, practical and direct. She told Cassie that the $500,000 from the checking account was not an afterthought or a punishment. She wrote that most Americans work their entire lives without accumulating a fraction of that sum, and that she had left it specifically because she believed, in spite of everything, that Cassie was still capable of using it as a foundation rather than a conclusion. She wrote, "I am not giving you a lesser portion because I love you less. I am giving you what I believe you need, rather than what I believe you want, which is," she wrote, "the most honest definition of motherhood I have ever been able to find." Near the bottom of the second page, Morton's voice slowed slightly, and I understood that he was approaching the part Eleanor had taken the most care with. She wrote that 2 years before her diagnosis, she had made a contribution of $2 million from her personal savings, funds accumulated before the trust was established and therefore not part of its principal, to a foundation in Virginia that provided financial and legal support to women rebuilding their lives after domestic hardship. She had made the contribution in Cassie's name. She wrote, "I do not know who you will be in 10 years, Cassie, or what choices you will have made by then, but I wanted your name attached to something good while I still had the means to do it. Whatever you decide about your own life, that is already done, and it cannot be undone, and somewhere a woman you will never meet is safer because of your name on a piece of paper. I thought you should know that, **. Morton refolded the letter and set it gently on the desk. Neither of us spoke for a moment. I said quietly that she had known, that Eleanor had seen all of it coming and had prepared for each possibility with the same methodical care she had brought to every important decision of her life. Morton said yes. He said that in 20 years of practicing estate law, he had encountered thorough planning, and he had encountered compassionate planning, but that what Eleanor had constructed was something he found genuinely rare, a document architecture that was simultaneously airtight and merciful, that protected without punishing, that anticipated the worst and still managed to leave room for something better. I looked out the window at the street below, where the March morning was brightening now into something that almost resembled warmth. I thought about the evenings I had come into the bedroom to find Eleanor with her papers spread across the blanket and her reading glasses on, and how I had accepted without question her explanation that it was nothing I needed to worry about. She had been right. She had handled it. She had always handled it. I just had not understood the full scope of what handling it had required of her. Then Morton's assistant knocked once and opened the door 2 inches. She said there was a call holding from a legal office in Richmond, and that the party had identified themselves as representing the Hartwell family. Morton thanked her and said he would return the call shortly. He looked at me across the desk with an expression that was not alarm but was the next nearest thing to it. He said, "Gerald, I think we should talk about what comes next, and I think we should talk about it now." Morton did not take the call immediately. He asked his assistant to tell the party he would return within the hour, and she pulled the door closed again without a word. He folded his hands on the desk in front of him and took a breath that was slow and considered, the breath of a man reorganizing his thoughts into their correct order before he speaks, and then he told me what we were facing. Cassie had retained an attorney. The firm was based in Richmond, a civil litigation practice with a specialty in estate and trust disputes, which told Morton that she had not picked a name out of a directory but had sought out someone specific for a specific purpose. He said this was not unexpected. He had anticipated that once Cassie understood the full picture, she would look for a legal avenue, because people in her position almost always did. What mattered, he said, was not that she had hired a lawyer, but what that lawyer was likely to find when he reviewed the situation carefully. Morton believed the answer was nothing actionable. The trust documentation was sound. The transfer of assets had been conducted 18 months before Eleanor's death, well outside any window that might invite a challenge on grounds of diminished capacity. Eleanor had been of completely clear mind and thoroughly documented health at the time of signing. Morton himself had ensured that a physician's letter attesting to her competency was filed alongside the trust documents precisely because he had known from long experience that airtight structures invite challenges and that challenges require answers prepared in advance. He said the deed required no discussion at all. The county record was unambiguous. No attorney reviewing it would advise a client to contest it, because there was nothing to contest. It was a public document filed decades ago and never altered, and the law in Virginia on the matter of sole ownership was not a matter of interpretation. I asked him how long this would take to resolve. He said that if Cassie's attorney was competent, which he assumed he was, the attorney would review the trust instrument and the deed within 2 weeks and advise her that she had no viable claim. If the attorney was less scrupulous, he might file preliminary motions anyway in hopes of pressuring a settlement, and in that case we would respond to each motion with documentation, and the matter would be dismissed, likely within 90 days. He said I should not worry about the cost of his time, because Eleanor had placed a specific allocation within the trust for exactly this contingency. He said it with a trace of something in his voice that I might have called admiration if I had not already exhausted that word in the previous hour. Then he reached into the lower drawer of his desk and placed on the surface in front of me a small envelope. It was sealed, the flap properly gummed and pressed flat, with Cassie's name written on the front in Eleanor's handwriting. Below the name, also in Eleanor's hand, a single instruction, from her father. Morton said Eleanor had given him this envelope at their final session together. She had been specific, it was not to go through Morton's office. It was not to arrive in any formal or legal context. It was to be given to me, and I was to deliver it to Cassie myself by hand, at whatever moment I judged to be the right one. Morton said he had not read it. Eleanor had told him only that it was a private letter, a mother's letter, separate from everything else, and that its delivery should belong to me and not to the process. I picked the envelope up and held it for a moment. It was light. 2 or 3 pages at most, folded once. I thought about Eleanor at what must have been one of her last sessions in this office, still doing the work, still thinking about Cassie, still finding one more thing she could arrange to protect the possibility of something better. I thought about what it had cost her, not financially, but in the deeper currency of hope, to write a letter she had to believe might never be needed. She had written it anyway. Because with Eleanor, the preparation was always an act of love rather than an act of fear. And she had never been willing to leave love undone simply because its outcome was uncertain. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket beside the letter she had written to me. The two of them together made a slight weight against my ribs that I was aware of for the rest of the morning. Morton walked me to the door and shook my hand again. He said he would call me as soon as he had spoken with the attorney from Richmond and that I should feel free to call him at any time if anything arose at the house. He said this like a man who expects things to arise. I thanked him for the coffee and for the morning and for 20 years of knowing which things required saying and which did not. He nodded once in the way that stood with Morton for considerably more than a nod. I drove home through the late March morning with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The route took me past the church where Eleanor's funeral had been held, and I did not look at it directly, but I was aware of it in my peripheral vision, the white steeple against the pale sky, there and then gone. The 2 envelopes sat in my pocket. The house, when I pulled into the driveway, was mine, in the full legal sense of that word. And yet, standing in front of it with my key in my hand, I felt something I had not expected. Not relief. Not vindication. Mostly I felt tired and grateful and very alone, and underneath those things, somewhere quieter and more durable, I felt Eleanor. Not her absence. Her. The shape of what she had done still holding the way good structures hold. Douglas Parrish appeared at my back door at 11:30 that same morning. The way Douglas had been appearing at my back door for 17 years, without announcement and without apology, carrying something in his hand that constituted sufficient justification for the intrusion. Today it was a foil-covered pan of his wife's cornbread, which she had been making for me in rotating shifts with her chicken soup since Eleanor's funeral, and which I had been eating mechanically and gratefully without tasting any of it. He set the pan on the counter, helped himself to a coffee mug, and sat at the kitchen table with the easy familiarity of a man who long ago made peace with the difference between his home and yours. I told him everything Morton had shared, the deed, the trust, the letter for Cassie, the call from the Richmond attorney that had come in before I'd even left the office. I told it plainly and in order, and Douglas listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued most about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table. Then he said that Eleanor had always been the sharpest person in any room she entered, that he had suspected for some time she was doing something important in those final months, and that he was glad she had gotten it done. I asked why he had suspected. He said that at a neighborhood dinner the previous October, before Eleanor had grown too ill to attend such things, he had watched her watch Cassie for an entire evening from across a long table, and the quality of her attention had struck him as the kind a person brings to a problem they are actively solving. He said he hadn't mentioned it at the time because it wasn't his business, and because Eleanor had seemed to have it well in hand, which, he said now, she clearly did. I spent the early part of the afternoon doing the ordinary things that keep a person functional and present when the extraordinary things have temporarily exceeded their capacity to be processed. I took the cornbread out of the foil and put it in a proper dish. I walked the back garden and checked the roses along the fence, which were beginning to show the first tentative color of early spring, and I thought about Eleanor putting them in, kneeling in the March mud 8 years ago with her gardening gloves and her absolute certainty about where each plant belonged. I pulled a few weeds from the bed nearest the gate. I felt useful for approximately 11 minutes, and then I went back inside. Morton called at 2 in the afternoon. He had spoken with the attorney from Richmond, a man named Grover, from a firm Morton knew by reputation. He said the conversation had been professional and without antagonism, the way Morton preferred these things to go and usually a reasonable indicator of how they would end. Grover had asked questions about the trust structure and the deed, and Morton had answered them fully and agreed to send over the relevant documentation by end of business. Morton said Grover had been careful not to reveal his client's position, which was standard practice, but that a competent attorney receiving that documentation would draw the obvious conclusions within a week. He said I should not expect to hear anything further for 10 days at minimum, possibly 2 weeks, and that I should try not to spend that time in the particular variety of suspended agitation that estate disputes tended to produce in people unaccustomed to the pace of legal process. I told him I would do my best. He said he knew I would and that he would be in touch. I did not hear from Cassie that day, nor the next. I later understood, through the account she gave me herself, what those 2 days had looked like from her end, and the picture she described was not one I could take any satisfaction in. Her attorney had called her the evening of Morton's document delivery, a Thursday, and walked her through what he had found. The trust was valid and unassailable. The transfer had been conducted well within the bounds of competency and proper notice. The deed showed my name alone, unchanged from its original filing. The $500,000 in Eleanor's checking account had already been distributed to Cassie per Eleanor's standing instructions. That, Grover had told her as gently as his professional context permitted, was the complete picture. Cassie had known, somewhere beneath the certainty she had been carrying since January, that there was more to the story than the 12-year-old will she had found in that Staunton office. She had known it the way you know a thing you have decided not to examine because the examination might cost you something you are not ready to surrender. And now the bill had come. $500,000, which Brent had already partly reduced without her knowledge, drawing from their joint account for purposes she had not been consulted on. A number that was real and significant but was nonetheless not the number she had been calculating on. The house in Charlottesville appeared in none of her legal options. A trust document with her name appearing once in the distribution section, with a figure beside it that was final. She told me later that she had sat on the floor of their apartment in Richmond for a long time after the call ended. Not crying. Just sitting. Rearranging, I imagine, the entire architecture of the preceding months into its correct shape now that she could no longer avoid seeing it clearly. I did not know any of that on Thursday evening. I only knew that my phone had not rung, that the house was quiet, and that the 2 letters in my jacket pocket were still waiting for the right moment, which had not yet arrived. When the phone finally rang on Friday morning and I looked at the screen and saw Cassie's name, I stood in the kitchen for one full breath before I answered. I heard the sound she made when the call connected, something that was not quite a word and not quite a name, a single syllable that cracked cleanly down the middle like greenwood under pressure. "Dad," she said, and then nothing else for a moment. Just the sound of my daughter on the other end of the line, finally out of calculations, with nowhere left to go but the truth. I said her name back to her, just that, and waited. The silence on the line had a different quality than the silences Cassie usually deployed. Those were considered, tactical pauses with purpose behind them. This one was unstructured, the silence of someone who has arrived at the edge of a prepared speech and found that the words they had rehearsed have dissolved. She said she needed to talk to me. She said it the way people say things they have been arguing themselves into for hours, with a flatness that comes not from indifference but from the effort of getting to the point before the courage runs out. I said I was home. She asked if she could come. I said she knew where the house was. Douglas was still at the kitchen table when I hung up. He looked at me, and I told him Cassie was coming. He stood up without a word, rinsed his mug in the sink, and said he would be next door if I needed him. He put on his jacket and went out the back door, and I watched him cross the yard to the gap in the fence that connected our properties, moving with the unhurried dignity of a man who understands that certain things require privacy and that the highest form of friendship is knowing when to leave. I had known Douglas Parrish for 17 years and had never once had to explain that to him. She arrived 40 minutes later. I heard her car in the driveway and then the sound of the car door closing, not the efficient slam she usually gave it, but something slower and more uncertain, as though even that small action required more deliberateness than usual. I had brewed a fresh pot of coffee. I had done it without deciding. My hands had simply moved to the cabinet and the filters and the water while the rest of me stood very still in the center of the kitchen, thinking about the last time my daughter had sat across from me at this table and what she had said. She looked diminished when she came through the door. Not in height, not in the physical sense, but in some quality of sureness that she had carried her whole adult life like a second coat. Her hair was pulled back, and she was wearing clothes she clearly had not selected for any audience, plain dark slacks, a gray sweater, flat shoes. The pearl earrings were gone. She sat down at the kitchen table, put her hands in her lap, and looked at the surface between us. I set a cup of coffee in front of her, sat down in the chair opposite, and did not say anything. I had decided somewhere in the 40 minutes between her call and her arrival that I would not speak first, not from cruelty, but from the simple understanding that whatever needed to happen in this kitchen had to be initiated by the person who had broken it. She started slowly. She said that the weeks after Eleanor died had been harder than she had expected. That grief did things to a person's thinking. That she had been under significant stress with Brent and with the finances and with trying to manage everything at once. I listened. I kept my face still and my hands around my coffee cup, and I listened to all of it without interrupting. Some of what she said was true, and some of it was the architecture of excuse, and I had been listening to people long enough to know the difference without needing to identify it out loud. She talked about Brent. About the ways he had shaped her perspective over 6 years. The things he had persuaded her to believe were practical rather than cold. The way a person's reasoning can shift so gradually under sustained influence that they do not notice the distance they have traveled, until they are already somewhere unrecognizable. When she got to the legal situation, she spoke carefully, watching my face. She said she understood now about the trust. She said she understood about the house. She said she wanted me to know that the decision to have the real estate agent come through had been as much Brent's initiative as hers, though she acknowledged that she had not resisted it. I said, I understand. I said it without particular warmth or coolness, simply as a statement of fact, because I did understand, in the way that understanding a thing and forgiving it are two separate processes that do not always move at the same time. She asked about the trust, not in the grasping way she would have asked 3 weeks ago, but with the quieter question of someone trying to understand what had actually happened. I told her what Morton had told me, that her mother had built it over 18 months, that she had done it carefully and completely, and that I had not requested it and had not known its full scope until after Eleanor was gone. I said her mother had made sure I was taken care of. Cassie nodded slowly, and something moved across her face that I could not entirely name, remorse perhaps, or the particular species of sorrow that arrives when a person finally understands what they had and what they did with it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the March afternoon was moving toward 4 o'clock, and the light was thinning in the way it does in early spring, golden at the edges and uncertain at the center. I set my cup down on the table, looked at my daughter, and said that I had one question for her. I said I needed her to actually think about it before she answered. Cassie looked up from the table and met my eyes. The kitchen held its breath. I sat at this same table 3 days after we buried your mother. Do you remember what you said to me? And I need to know whether you meant it. Cassie looked at me across the table for a long moment. Then she looked down at her hands and said that she had not been herself that morning. That grief does things a person cannot always account for. That she had been frightened and overwhelmed, and that what she said had come out in a way she had not intended. She said it quietly, without her usual precision, the words arriving in the slightly blurred way of something that has been rehearsed but whose rehearsal has not survived contact with the actual moment. I let her finish. Then I said, as evenly as I could manage, that I did not believe she had not been herself. I said I believed she had been entirely herself, and that was the thing neither of us could afford to pretend otherwise about. She looked up when I said it. I said that the woman who sat in that chair 3 days after we buried her mother and told her father to find somewhere else to die was not a stranger wearing Cassie's face. She was Cassie. And if we were going to have any kind of honest conversation in this kitchen, it had to start from that. The silence that followed was not comfortable, and I did not try to make it so. Discomfort in this context was not something to be managed, it was information. I told her about the funeral. Not about the ceremony itself, she had been there for all of that, but about what I had heard from the bedroom above the living room that evening after the guests had gone, when the house was quiet enough to carry sound through the floors. I told her exactly what I had heard, word for word, about the house and the $850,000, and getting someone through before spring. Cassie did not deny it. She did not offer an explanation or a qualification. She simply sat with it, and the color in her face shifted in a way that told me the words had landed where I intended them to land, not as an accusation, but as a mirror. Then I talked about her mother. Not about the trust, not about the legal structure, not about any of the documents Morton had spread across his desk. I talked about Eleanor herself, about the 30 years she had spent building what she built, dollar by dollar and decision by decision, not because it had come easily or because circumstances had favored her, but because she had applied a quality of disciplined attention to our financial life that most people reserve for the things they are passionate about. And Eleanor had been passionate about it genuinely, in the way she was passionate about the garden, and about music, and about the people she loved. I talked about the early 90s, a period Cassie had been too young to understand at the time, the years when the engineering firm had come close to failing, when we had carried debt that kept me awake more nights than I had ever admitted. And Eleanor had not panicked, and had not complained, and had simply begun, with the same quiet persistence she brought to everything, finding the path through. She had never once in those years made me feel diminished by needing her steadiness. That was the rarest thing, I said. Not the money. That. I said that $500,000 was not a punishment. I said that most people in this country worked their entire lives without accumulating a fraction of that sum, and that Eleanor had known this and had intended the amount as a beginning rather than a verdict. I said that her mother had seen her, clearly, had seen the ambition and the fear and the ways that 6 years with a certain kind of man had gradually rearranged what Cassie believed she was entitled to, and had loved her through all of it. With open eyes, without sentimentality, and without ever once giving up on the person she believed her daughter was underneath all of that accumulated armor. Cassie was looking at the table again. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she was working to contain something she did not want to show. I reached into my jacket pocket. I had carried it there since Morton's office, the sealed envelope with Cassie's name in Eleanor's handwriting, light as 3 folded pages, patient as everything else Eleanor had left behind. I set it on the table between us and said that Morton had kept this. I said Eleanor had been specific that I was to deliver it myself, not through any legal channels, not as part of any official process, but by my own hand at the right moment. I said I had been waiting for the right moment. And this was it. Cassie looked at the envelope for a long time without touching it. Then she picked it up carefully, the way you pick up something you understand to be irreplaceable, and opened it. I watched her read. I did not watch her face so much as the quality of her attention, the way her eyes moved across each line, the small changes in her breathing, the moment her hands shifted on the pages and I saw that they were not trembling. They were entirely steady. She read the whole letter without stopping, turned the second page, finished it, and then sat for a moment with the pages held in both hands and her eyes lowered. Not reading anymore. Just holding. When she looked up, her eyes were red and wet. But what was in them was not the grief of losing a number or a property or a calculation that had failed to deliver. It was something older and less manageable than that. She opened her mouth, and her voice arrived barely above a whisper. She said she knew everything, knew all of it about herself, and then the sentence stopped because she could not find the end of it. Or perhaps because the end of it was too large for the room. I reached into my jacket pocket a second time and placed on the table another, smaller envelope with Cassie's name again in Eleanor's hand. I said her mother had left this as well. I said it was only for her. Cassie looked at the second envelope the way she had looked at the first, with a stillness that was not hesitation but something closer to reverence, the careful attention of a person who has already been surprised once by what a piece of paper can contain and is now approaching the next one with the full knowledge of what it costs to read something that cannot be unread. She turned it over once in her hands, then opened it, unfolding 2 pages that were written in the same smaller, more deliberate version of Eleanor's handwriting I had seen in the letter left for me, the careful cursive of those last months when getting the words down correctly had required more physical effort than it once had. And Eleanor had made that effort without complaint and without reduction. I had not read this letter. Morton had not read it. It was entirely Eleanor's, private in the fullest sense. And I watched my daughter read it the way I had watched her read the first, with the quality of a person receiving something they are not entirely sure they deserve and are trying, in spite of that uncertainty, to receive honestly. I did not know the full contents of what Eleanor had written until Cassie told me about it later, piece by piece over several conversations in the weeks that followed. What I understood from watching Cassie's face as she read was that Eleanor had not opened with the present. She had opened with the past. The distant past. The part that predated every disappointment and every hardening, and every year in which the woman Cassie had been becoming had gradually obscured the child Eleanor had raised. She had written about specific memories, the kind you can only write if you have been holding them so long and so carefully that they have stayed perfectly intact, the exact color and texture of the original moment undimmed. She wrote about Cassie at 4 years old, asleep on Eleanor's shoulder in an airport in Charlotte after a flight delay that had stretched a 2-hour layover into 5, the full weight of the child's head against Eleanor's collarbone, the particular warmth of a sleeping 4-year-old who has given up on staying awake and trusted completely in the person holding them. She wrote about the spring of Cassie's 6th grade year, when Cassie had memorized a long poem for a school assembly and had stood at the microphone in the gymnasium without notes and delivered every line without flinching, and Eleanor had watched from the 3rd row and had felt a pride so physical it had surprised her, the kind that moves through the chest rather than residing merely in the mind. She wrote about the evening Cassie had decided at age 14 to cook dinner for the two of us entirely on her own, the research she had done, the grocery list she had made, the serious and slightly terrified expression she had worn in the kitchen for 2 hours, and the fact that one side of the chicken had burned because she had been so focused on the vegetables that she had forgotten to check the pan, and how we had eaten every bite of it anyway without mentioning the burned side, because the effort of the thing had been so plainly given from the best part of who she was. Cassie's hands shifted on the pages. She did not look up. Eleanor had written then about what she had observed in the more recent years, not with bitterness, Cassie told me later, and not with the exhausted disappointment of a parent who has given up, but with clarity, the same clarity she had brought to financial statements and garden planning and every other thing she had cared enough about to see accurately. She had written that she had watched certain qualities in her daughter go quiet over time, not disappear but go underground, the way a plant goes dormant rather than dead, and that she had chosen to believe in the dormancy rather than mourn the absence. She had written that the money she had left was not intended to solve anything, or resolve anything, or purchase any particular outcome. It was intended to provide enough space for Cassie to breathe without Brent's hand on every financial decision, enough ground under her feet to stand on her own and remember what standing on her own felt like. She had written, and this was the line Cassie quoted to me word for word weeks later with the same quiet precision she might have used to read from scripture, *, are you still a good person, Cassie? I believe you are. I think you have simply spent several years forgetting it, and I think the forgetting was not entirely your fault, but only you can decide what to do about that now, *. When Cassie lowered the pages, I did not speak immediately. The kitchen held the particular late afternoon silence of a house in early spring, the furnace cycling off, the light through the window going from gold to gray. Cassie refolded the letter with the same careful hand she had used to open it, held it against her chest for a moment, and then set it on the table. Then she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on my daughter's face in a very long time, open, uncertain, with none of the practiced composure she had worn like a garment for the better part of a decade. She said she wanted to ask me something, and she needed me to answer her honestly. She said she did not understand why I had brought these letters to her. She said I had every right never to speak to her again after what she had said at this table, in this kitchen, 3 days after we buried her mother. She said that in my position, she was not sure she could have done what I had done this afternoon, and she needed to know why I had. I said because her mother had trusted me to. I said because 43 years ago I had made a habit of doing what Eleanor trusted me to do, and I was not prepared to stop now simply because she was no longer here to see it. Cassie was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I had not anticipated, not a question, not an apology, but a statement arrived at slowly and with obvious cost, the kind of thing a person says when they have finally gotten honest enough with themselves to say it out loud. She said she thought she needed to leave Brent. She said it simply and without drama, and I understood from the way she said it that she had been thinking it for longer than this afternoon. Before I could respond, her phone on the table buzzed once, screen up. She glanced at it, and what happened to her face in the half-second that followed was not irritation and was not surprise. It was the particular blanching stillness of someone who has just seen something that confirms a thing they had hoped was not yet true. She turned the phone face down on the table without responding to whatever she had seen, but the gesture was too deliberate to be casual, and we both knew it. I did not ask. I waited the way I had been waiting all afternoon. After a moment, she picked the phone back up and read it again, more slowly this time, and then she said it out loud so I could hear. The message was from Brent. It was not long, and it had not been composed with any awareness that anyone other than Cassie would ever see it, which meant it had the particular unguarded quality of a person communicating in what they believed to be complete privacy. He wrote that he had spoken with a different attorney, someone outside Grover's firm, and that this new attorney believed there were grounds to challenge the trust on the basis that Cassie had provided material assistance in managing the family's financial affairs over the preceding decade. He wrote that all she needed to do was confirm this in a signed statement, just a simple document, a few sentences saying she had been involved in investment decisions. He wrote that they were looking at $31 million and that she needed to think about what she was throwing away by not fighting for it. He ended with a sentence I read twice and then set the phone down. He wrote that she owed it to their future to pursue every available option, and that if she was not willing to do that, then he was not sure what exactly they were doing together. I looked at the phone sitting on the table between us. Then I looked at my daughter. She was watching me read it the way a person watches someone open a door they have been standing behind for a long time, with the complicated relief of something finally being seen. I asked her one question. I asked whether she had ever, at any point, been involved in managing Eleanor's investment accounts or making decisions about the portfolio. Cassie said no, flatly and without hesitation. The first completely unhedged answer she had given me all afternoon. She said she had not known the details of Eleanor's financial structure any more than I had. She said her name had never appeared on any account. She said Brent knew this. I picked up my phone and called Morton. He answered before the second ring. I told him about the message and read it to him verbatim. There was a brief silence on his end, not surprise, but the particular stillness of a man confirming something he had already partly anticipated. He said the claim Brent was describing had no legal foundation. Eleanor's accounts had been managed exclusively through her own brokerage relationship, documented in 18 months of correspondence and transaction records that showed a single account holder operating without any co-manager or advisory participant. He said any attorney worth his license would see this within an hour of reviewing the file, and that what Brent was actually proposing was that Cassie sign a false statement, which Morton suggested she declined to do with considerable firmness. I asked Morton whether he had received anything formal from the new attorney Brent mentioned. Morton said not yet, but that he would be watching for it, and that if anything was filed we would respond immediately and comprehensively. He said I should not be alarmed. I said I was not alarmed. I said I was tired, which was a different thing, and Morton said he understood completely and to call him if anything else came through. When I ended the call, Cassie was sitting with her elbows on the table and her face in her hands, not crying, just holding herself still in the way a person does when they are processing something they had known was coming and are nonetheless finding more difficult than they expected. I gave her a moment. Then I told her what Morton had said, the part about the false statement, and I said it plainly because she needed to hear it plainly, that what Brent was asking her to do was not aggressive or strategic or ambitious, it was dishonest. And that if she signed anything of the kind, she would be attaching her name to a lie in a legal context, and Eleanor's money was not worth that, not any portion of it. Cassie took her hands from her face and looked at the table. She said she knew. I thought about Douglas then, and something he had mentioned to me in passing several weeks before Eleanor died, a neighborhood gathering at the Hendersons the previous October that I had not attended because Eleanor had been having a difficult week and I had not wanted to leave her. Douglas had described it briefly afterward, said it had been pleasant, nothing remarkable. But he had mentioned in the offhand way Douglas sometimes surfaced things he had been quietly considering for a while, that Brent had said something at dinner about expecting a significant financial development in the near term. Had said it with a particular ease, Douglas had noted, like a man who has already seen the end of a movie and is sitting through the middle out of obligation. I had not thought much of it at the time. I thought of it now with a clarity that arrived too late to be anything other than confirmation of what I already knew, that Brent had been calculating this outcome for considerably longer than the week since Eleanor's funeral. That he had looked at an aging woman with a serious illness and a substantial estate and had seen, before she was even gone, a sequence of events that he intended to position himself inside. I did not say this to Cassie. I did not need to. She was her mother's daughter underneath everything, and her mother's daughter was perfectly capable of arriving at a true conclusion once she had cleared away whatever had been obstructing the view. She picked up her phone and looked at Brent's message one more time. Then she put the phone in her pocket and said she was going to call Grover in the morning and tell him she would not be pursuing any legal action against the trust, and that she wanted her name removed from all related correspondence. I said that was the right decision. She nodded once, slowly, the nod of a person not seeking approval but simply marking a turn that has been made and cannot now be unmade. Then Morton called back. I answered. And he said, in the measured tone he used when something required careful delivery, that a preliminary filing had come through in the last 20 minutes from an attorney named Stillman, out of Richmond, on behalf of Brent Hartwell personally. Not Cassie. Brent. He said the filing claimed that as Cassie's spouse, Brent had an indirect beneficial interest in any inheritance she had been improperly denied, and that he was seeking an emergency injunction to prevent distribution of trust assets pending a full review. Morton paused for exactly one beat and then said that the filing was without merit, and he had already begun preparing the response, but that I should be aware the next several weeks would require some patience. He said it would be resolved. He said he wanted me to hear that clearly. I said I heard him. After I ended the call, I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Then I looked at Cassie across the kitchen table and told her what Brent had done, not as an accusation toward her, simply as a fact she needed to have. Cassie did not move from her chair when I told her. She sat with the information the way you sit with something that is heavy but not surprising, the weight of it familiar, even if the precise shape of it was new. Brent had filed on his own behalf. His own name, not hers. She said it back to me quietly, not as a question but as a person confirming they have heard correctly, and then she was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shed the last of its uncertainty. She said she wanted to give Morton a statement. She said she wanted to put in writing, formally and on record, that she had had no involvement in managing Eleanor's financial affairs and no advisory role in any investment decision at any point. She said she wanted it filed before the week was out. I called Morton back immediately and told him. There was a brief pause on his end, and then he said that a voluntary statement from Cassie, submitted of her own accord and without legal compulsion, would be among the most effective responses he could include in his filing. He said it would also, in his professional opinion, substantially shorten the timeline of the entire proceeding because it directly undermined the foundational premise of Brent's claim. He said he would have a draft ready for Cassie's review by the following morning. She took the phone from my hand and confirmed this with Morton herself, and the steadiness in her voice when she spoke to him was something I had not heard from her in years. Not the performed steadiness of someone managing an impression, but the simpler, quieter kind that belongs to a person who has made an honest decision and is standing inside it. Morton filed his full response 4 days later. I did not read every page of it, but he walked me through the substance in a phone call that ran 40 minutes, long from Morton, and telling me he had been thorough in a way that went beyond the merely adequate. Eleanor's records were, as Morton had told me from the beginning, without gap or ambiguity. 18 months of account statements, correspondence with the brokerage, transaction confirmations, tax documents, all of it in Eleanor's name alone. All of it managed through a single direct relationship with her financial advisor at a firm in Charlottesville she had worked with for 19 years. There was no thread Brent's attorney could pull that did not lead immediately to Eleanor, and only Eleanor, and the meticulous paper trail she had maintained with the same conscientiousness she had brought to everything else. Morton said that Cassie's voluntary statement had been filed as a primary exhibit. He said Stillman, the attorney Brent had retained, was a reasonably competent man and would recognize within days of reviewing the response what the actual situation was. The question was whether Brent would authorize him to withdraw the filing or insist on pushing it to a hearing. While we waited, Cassie filed for divorce. She did it without ceremony and without informing Brent in advance, through her own attorney in Richmond, on a Thursday morning 12 days after she had sat at my kitchen table and read Eleanor's letters. She called me that afternoon to tell me. I asked how she was. She said she was clear, which was not the same as fine but was considerably more durable. I said I thought so too. She said she had moved out of the apartment and was staying with a college friend in Crozet, about 20 minutes from Charlottesville, and that she would be there for the foreseeable future. I said the guest room was available if she needed it. She said she knew, and thank you, and that she was not ready for that quite yet, but that she appreciated the offer more than she could properly say. We talked for another 15 minutes about nothing in particular, and it was the most natural conversation we had managed in longer than I could accurately remember. Brent's response to the divorce filing was not graceful. Through his attorney, he communicated an offer to withdraw the trust litigation in exchange for a financial settlement from Cassie out of her inherited funds, a figure that Morton described as audacious and that I will not repeat because it does not deserve the dignity of being recorded. Cassie declined without counteroffer. Brent then communicated through the same channel that he was in possession of information about the Whitmore family that he was prepared to make available to interested parties if matters were not resolved to his satisfaction. Morton passed this along to me with the careful neutrality of a man delivering a message he considers beneath serious response but that professional obligation requires him to convey. I told Morton to tell Stillman, in whatever language was appropriate for a legal communication, that we had nothing to conceal and no interest in negotiating under the pressure of an unspecified threat. I said that Eleanor and I had lived an ordinary and decent life, that our finances were documented to the penny, and that if Brent Hartwell had something he believed was worth disclosing, he should disclose it and we would address it on its actual merits. Morton said he would convey the substance of that response. He sounded, for just a moment, faintly pleased. The hearing on Brent's injunction was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late April. 3 days before it was set to begin, Morton called me in the early evening to tell me that Stillman had not yet filed the withdrawal, which likely meant Brent intended to let it proceed to the courtroom. I thanked Morton and sat with that information for an hour over a reheated plate of Douglas's wife's chicken soup. Then I went to bed and slept for the first time in several weeks without interruption. The next morning, I was in the garden checking the rose beds when I heard the sound of a car I did not recognize pulling slowly into my driveway. I straightened up and turned around. Brent Hartwell was standing at the end of the front walk alone, without his portfolio, without his attorney, without any of the apparatus he usually carried. He looked smaller than I remembered. He raised one hand in a gesture that was not quite a wave and met my eyes across the yard. He said he would like to come in. He said there was something he wanted to discuss directly, just the two of us, before Thursday. I looked at him across the yard for a moment without moving. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of April morning that arrives in Virginia like an apology for February, and the garden behind me was showing the first real color of the season. The roses Eleanor had planted were coming into bud along the white fence, pale pink at the tips, exactly as she had intended them. I pulled off my gardening gloves, tucked them into my jacket pocket, walked to the front door, and held it open. I did not say anything. He came in. I led him to the living room rather than the kitchen. The kitchen was Eleanor's room, the room where the real things had happened in this house, and I was not willing to let this conversation occupy that space. The living room was more neutral, more formal, the room we had used for people we did not know well enough yet to invite further in. I sat in the armchair near the window. He took the sofa across from me and sat forward with his elbows on his knees, a posture I recognized as studied, the posture of a man who has practiced appearing earnest and believes the physical arrangement of his body communicates something about his intentions. He was not wearing a tie, I noticed that. He had made a calculation about how to present himself this morning, and the calculation had included removing the tie. He started with the approach I had expected him to start with, because Brent had always operated in a predictable sequence when he wanted something, beginning with the version of himself that was most appealing before moving to the versions that were less so. He said he wanted to speak plainly, man to man, without attorneys and without the formality of legal proceedings, because he felt that much of what had happened over the past weeks had been the result of poor communication and escalating pressure rather than any genuine conflict of values. He said he had great respect for Eleanor's legacy and for everything the Whitmore family represented. He used the word legacy twice in 3 sentences and looked directly at me when he said it, the way a person looks at you when they are monitoring whether a word is landing. I said nothing. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my eyes on him and waited. He moved to the second approach. He said that he and Cassie were going through a painful period, and that pain made people reactive, and that some of the legal actions that had been initiated might have been initiated in a state of reactivity rather than clear judgment, and that he was open to finding a way to step back from all of it if there was a path that made sense for everyone involved. He said he was not an unreasonable man. He said he wanted me to know that. He said he thought there might be a way to resolve things quietly that did not require a courtroom and did not require anyone to walk away feeling that they had lost. I said I was listening. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a document folded in thirds. He placed it on the cushion beside him and smoothed it flat with one hand. He said it was a simple letter, a single paragraph attesting that Cassie had contributed to the family's financial planning over the years in an advisory capacity. He said it did not need to be formal. He said it did not need to go through Morton. He said just my signature, acknowledging what we both knew to be generally true about how involved Cassie had always been in family matters, and he could have Stillman withdraw the filing by end of business today, and this would all be finished. I looked at the document on the cushion. Then I looked at him. I said that what he had described was not a letter. I said it was a false statement in support of a fraudulent legal claim, and that he had come to the home of a 68-year-old man who had buried his wife 6 weeks ago and asked him to commit perjury as a condition of being left in peace. I said it without heat. I said it the way I would have told a surveyor that his numbers were wrong, as a simple statement of what was actually true, without any particular feeling about it beyond the necessity of accuracy. Brent began to say something. The door opened. Cassie came in without knocking. She had a key she had never returned and had clearly driven from Crozet without calling ahead because she had seen on some shared account or some notification she had not yet disabled that Brent's car had appeared at this address. She stood in the doorway and took in the room in one look, her father in the armchair, her husband on the sofa, the document sitting on the cushion between them. Her face was very still. She crossed the room and picked up the document from the sofa cushion without asking permission and read it. It took approximately 20 seconds. She refolded it, held it in her hand, and looked at Brent with an expression I can only describe as final. She said his name once. She said that she had given Morton her statement and it was already on record, and that there was nothing in that room, in that house, or in any document this attorney or any other attorney produced that she was going to sign. She said she wanted him to take the document and leave, and to conduct all further communication through their respective attorneys, because she did not intend to speak with him directly again until the divorce was settled. Brent looked at her. Then at me. Then he picked up the document, stood, and walked out of the living room. The front door opened and closed. I heard his car start in the driveway and back out and move away down the street until the sound of it disappeared entirely into the ordinary noise of the neighborhood. Cassie stood in the middle of the living room with her arms at her sides, and the house was very quiet around both of us. The particular quiet of a place from which something that did not belong has finally been removed. I stood up and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Cassie followed and sat at the table. I said there was one more thing I needed to tell her, something Morton had not yet covered, something Eleanor had arranged that Cassie did not know about yet. She looked at me across the table with clear, steady eyes and said she was ready to hear it. The kettle came to a boil. I poured the water, brought 2 cups to the table, and sat down. Cassie wrapped both hands around hers the way Eleanor always had, for the warmth rather than the coffee, and I noticed it the way you notice the things that persist in people across generations. The small inherited gestures that survive everything else. I told her I needed to take her to Morton's office. Not today, not immediately, but soon. Because what Eleanor had left could not be fully explained across a kitchen table, it needed to be seen in writing, in the formal and permanent way that Eleanor had always preferred for the things that mattered most. Cassie said whenever I was ready. I said tomorrow morning if that worked. She said it did. Morton was at his desk when we arrived at 9 o'clock, with coffee already on the credenza and 3 folders arranged in their familiar precise row. He stood when Cassie came in, shook her hand, and said he was glad she was there, and he said it with a directness that told her he meant it as something beyond professional courtesy. She sat in the chair to my left, the same chair she had occupied the morning he had read the will. And I watched her settle into it differently than she had that first time, less arrangement, less performance, the body language of a person who is not managing an outcome but simply present for what comes next. Morton opened the first folder and explained the educational subtrust. Eleanor had set aside $3 million, carved out of the trust principal and held in a separate account under Morton's administration, designated specifically for the education of Cassie's children, future children, potential children, children who did not yet exist and might not for years. Cassie had not had children during her marriage to Brent, a fact Eleanor had known and had not factored into her calculation at all. She had simply set the money aside and left it there, patient as everything else she had ever planted, operating on the assumption that her daughter's life was not finished and that what had not yet happened was not the same as what would never happen. Morton said the subtrust would remain intact and available for as long as Cassie lived, with no expiration condition and no requirement tied to her marital status. He said Eleanor had been explicit on that last point. Cassie looked at the folder on the desk and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly that her mother had believed in a version of her future that she herself had stopped believing in. Morton said, with the measured understatement of a man who had known Eleanor well, that belief had been one of her more consistent qualities. The second folder contained the documents establishing what Eleanor had called in her own handwriting on the founding charter the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation. It was a small nonprofit, properly registered in Virginia, with an endowment of $1.5 million and a stated mission of providing financial literacy education to women over 40 who were navigating significant life transitions, widowhood, divorce, retirement, the particular set of circumstances that left capable women without the tools or confidence to manage their own financial lives. Eleanor had built the framework herself with Morton's legal assistance over several sessions in the final year of her life. She had named me as the founding director, with full authority over grants and programming. And she had written into the charter a standing invitation, not a requirement, not a condition, simply an open door, for Cassie to join the board as co-director if and when she chose to do so. Morton read that provision twice, slowly, so that it landed completely. He said the foundation was funded, chartered, and ready to begin operating. He said the first board meeting could be whenever I decided to call it. I looked at Cassie. She was looking at the charter document Morton had slid across the desk, at the foundation's name printed at the top in clean formal type, Eleanor Whitmore Foundation, and below it the mission statement in Eleanor's own words, which Morton had preserved verbatim because he had understood they should not be paraphrased. Cassie touched the edge of the page with one finger. She did not look up when she spoke. She said she would like to be on the board. She said it was the least she could do and also the most she could think of, and she was not sure there was any difference between those two things right now. I said her mother would have been glad. I meant it as simply as I said it, without decoration, because it was true and because Eleanor had never had much patience for saying true things in complicated ways. Morton read one final passage before we left, a short paragraph Eleanor had written as a kind of preamble to the foundation charter, intended to be read aloud at the first board meeting, but which he felt, given the circumstances, belonged to this morning instead. Eleanor had written that money was not the thing that mattered about money. She wrote that what mattered was what it made possible, the stability that allowed a person to think clearly, the security that allowed a person to be generous, the ground under the feet that allowed a person to stand up straight and choose. She wrote that she had spent 30 years building those conditions for her family, not because she had loved money but because she had loved the life it made available to them, and she hoped they would use what she had left not to become something different, but to become more completely what they had always been capable of being. Morton closed the folder. The three of us sat for a moment in the particular stillness that follows something that has been said and received and cannot now be taken back. Then Cassie and I shook Morton's hand and walked out into the April morning, which had turned fully warm by mid-morning, the dogwoods along Water Street in their brief and extravagant bloom. A few weeks later, I was in the garden on a Saturday afternoon, working along the rose bed nearest the fence, when Douglas appeared in the gap with a bottle of cold beer in each hand and that expression he wore when he had arranged himself an excuse to come over. He sat in Eleanor's garden chair, handed me a bottle, and we stayed there in the late afternoon light without talking much, the way we had sat through the worst of the winter months, comfortable in the silence that belongs to people who have been neighbors long enough to not require noise to fill it. He asked after a while whether I thought I would be all right. I told him Eleanor had said I would be. He nodded at that as though it settled the matter, which for Douglas it did. When the light had gone golden and low across the fence, I bent down near the base of the post where Eleanor had tied the first climbing rose 8 years ago, reaching in to clear a knot of old twine, and my hand found something tucked between the fence boards and protected by a small square of clear plastic wrap fixed there with a rusted staple that had been there so long it had greened. I pulled it free carefully. A slip of notepaper no larger than an index card. In Eleanor's handwriting, faded by seasons but legible every word of it. She had written just 2 sentences, * you'll be all right. Both of you, * and below that a single initial, the way she had signed the small private things she left around the house for 35 years, the grocery lists and the birthday cards tucked into jacket pockets, the notes left on the kitchen counter on difficult mornings. Just the letter E. I held the paper in my hand and looked at it until the light shifted. Douglas asked from his chair whether I had found something. I said yes. He asked what. I said something Eleanor left behind. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that sounded about right. I folded the paper once, put it in my shirt pocket against my chest, and went back to the roses. That is the end of Gerald and Eleanor's story, and I have to tell you honestly that this one stayed with me long after I finished writing it. What struck me most was not the legal structure Eleanor built, or the way justice ultimately arrived quietly and completely, the way real justice usually does. What struck me was the quality of her love. Eleanor did not leave behind a revenge. She left behind an architecture of care so thorough and so patient that it protected everyone she loved, including the daughter who had hurt her. And she did it without bitterness and without a single wasted word. That is not a common thing. That is a rare and extraordinary thing. The lesson I take from this story is not about wills or trusts or what to put in whose name on a legal document, though those things matter, and you should absolutely speak with an attorney about your own affairs. If this story was of interest to you, please like, share, and subscribe. The deeper lesson is this: pay attention to the people beside you. Gerald had 43 years with a woman who was quietly doing the most important work of their shared life, and he loved her completely while understanding her only partially, and he would be the first to tell you that. Do not wait to understand someone fully before you love them, but do make the effort to see them clearly while they are still there to be seen. And if you are the Eleanor in your family, the one who holds things together and plans ahead, then love with patience rather than noise. Please know that the people around you feel it even when they cannot find the words for what they feel. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. It means more than you know.